ready for what I know from reading this paper is going to be a great session, and I'm very, very excited as a real fan of all things evidence-based, and to have the opportunity to introduce Denise, who has spent 20 years at Carnegie Mellon. But actually we were having a really interesting chat over lunch, where, and some of you may think about this occasionally, where we were talking about, in retrospect, what is it that we think has led us to do some of the work that we're doing? And Denise was sharing, or we were both sharing, father stories actually, quite an interesting story about how Denise, although we almost lost her to archaeology. I can't quite imagine what sort of research she would have done, but I'm sure it would have been equally fascinating. So we almost lost Denise to archaeology, and when she was in the early days of her studying, there was a very pivotal conversation with her father, who she picked up from work one day, and having studied a class in industrial psychology, I was very excitedly telling Dad this class that she studied in industrial psychology, for her father to say, they really need to find a way to stop her collecting and I think that's a really interesting and very heart-warming question for all of us to carry into this next session. I think this research into ideals and everything that connects with it is really quite critical to that question of how we make sure that we don't have work around people again. Denise is very, very welcome. Let's give her a warm round of applause.
It's a great pleasure for me to get to be here and talk with you about one of my favorite topics. I have to say that when I started out, I would have felt as an organizational psychologist, I would have felt quite embarrassed at the idea of promoting individuals to bargain for themselves, because I come from a blue-collar background, and the notion that we wouldn't bargain collectively, and our interests are collective, that's really kind of antithetical to how I was raised, and to some extent still believe is true, because I think the evidence supports the value of collective bargaining for the quality of employment relationships. On the other hand, institutionally the world's changed from what the world was in my childhood. At the same time, we know a lot more about human beings and their roles in organizations, and even back in the day of the more traditional employment relationship, idiosyncratic deals existed. And they exist in union shops and non-union shops, and they exist in the environment of benign employers and random Jenny Slammer employers and all sorts of other qualitative employers that are young. So let me talk with you in the next half hour or so about idiosyncratic deals, what they are, and how to make them work for the individual employee who has such a deal, the co-workers who, by definition, now have something may not be quite as advantaged potentially as the person with the deal, and the organization in which the deal is, or with whom the deal is made. So, what's an ideal? So, an idiosyncratic deal, I need to define 3 terms for you so we can talk about what the research tells us about the effect of employee bargaining on the quality of the employment relationship, the well-being of the people, and what happens in the organization in the aftermath. So, the idiosyncratic deal is some specific term or terms of employment that an employee negotiates that an employer authorizes and agrees to. So that's the key thing, is it's a specific term of employment negotiated by the employee. Could be initiated by the worker or the supervisor or by HR. That is part of something which I'm going to call the compensation bundle. What's a compensation bundle? Well, that's all the benefits and rewards, intrinsic and extrinsic, that are part of the employment relationship. And ideals are part of the larger exchange that is made between a person and the organization. So compensation bundles, kind of American football analogy, it's the whole 9 yards. It's the whole thing. Maybe shouldn't be using yards anymore, but I can't do football and metrics. So, okay. Then the last issue is, what's another term we're going to need to have our conversation is the psychological contract. So what's a psychological contract? Psychological contracts are beliefs that an individual, the worker, supervisor, employer, holds with regard to the mutual obligations in the employment relationship. So an individual's belief about what they owe and are owed in return, and ideals, these idiosyncratic deals, have an impact on the psychological contract. To wit, they actually introduce potentially new obligations to the psychological contract, either on the part of the employer or the employee, and sometimes even both. So having set that up, let's give you some examples of idiosyncratic deals. I'll give you four that are kind of easiest to think about. The most common idiosyncratic deal that exists are, and this would be in collective bargaining arrangements and all other situations, the simple fact that people with seniority have perks. Been there longer, are more trusted, have standing in the organization, and so it's quite common for veterans with the same job title as a junior worker to be doing very different tasks, having different notions of what constitutes their appropriate hours, their duties, their responsibilities than their more junior counterparts. And this phenomenon has been with us probably from time immemorial, but they come about in part because veterans are in a position to ask for things that are quite easily granted because of their standing. Stars get to customize people who are viewed in the organization as high performers. Very often are found to have more flexibility in their work arrangements. Not only are they perhaps better compensated, but also more likely to be granted their exceptions with regard to hours and what they do and when they do what they do, as, compared to the average or more typical employee. One of the ways in which I first started to see idiosyncratic deals, so special arrangements that an individual had bargained for, was when I started looking at what happened after people had had the experience of having their psychological contract violated. So if an employee went to complain because they had promised him or her a promotion and they didn't get it, one of the byproducts of that in many cases was, well, they couldn't give me a promotion, but we worked it out so I would get my preferred assignment with regard to the clients so that I could work on the skills in kind of work that I wanted to do and preferred to do, kind of as a substitute or a remedy for the promotion that didn't come. And that's quite a common use of idiosyncratic deals I've found in the fieldwork. Last issue, what are ideals? To a great extent, one might consider them to be kind of, in the words of the old French epithet, gifts well timed. So the idea that when somebody has done something special in the organization, they finished a risky assignment, a tough assignment, worked multiple weekends to deliver on something important, the employee may be in a better position to ask for and be granted something that he or she prefers. So it's the idea of the timely rewards that really are customized to the particular circumstances that an individual finds him or herself in. All of these kind of the normal ebb and flow of the employment relationship, but situations in which an individual is bargaining for something different than what their peers had might well meet with a positive response. But one of the things that's very important in talking about idiosyncratic deals, and I have to remember to make this sharp and clear, because I take it for granted sometimes because I've worked on ideals for a while, but I realize that lots of times when we talk about idiosyncratic deals, they can look like or sound like things we could call shady deals. The kinds of employment relationships and exceptions that are a lot less laudatory and a lot less benign and a lot less likely for coworkers to say, well, that's a reasonable thing to have granted this other person. So I want to differentiate ideals from two other kinds of not so nice special arrangements that individuals might get. And so we're going to call those other two things preferential treatment or favoritism, and the other one, unauthorized conduct or rule breaking. So idiosyncratic deals come about because things that employees want, they can't necessarily grant themselves. Hard to give me a pay raise on my own unless I steal from the till. Hard to change my job title, at least formally, unless I get HR and my boss to sign off on it. So idiosyncratic deals occur as a function of negotiation. The basis for them is, for whatever reason, the employer values this person and is willing to give them some special accommodation or perk. The purpose or the goal of it is to benefit the worker and the firm. And so the intended outcome is something of mutual gain. Let's contrast that with the shady deal. So first shady deal is preferential treatment or favoritism. So-and-so bargains, or so-and-so is able to, let's say, show up when he or she wants to and not get written up and have a complaint filed by the boss. Yeah, but it turns out this person's the boss's sister-in-law. Well, that's not quite an ideal. First, because it wasn't a negotiation based on the value of the person to the organization. It was a perk the person is taking because they know they can get away with it, because they're somebody with an in. In this case, to the boss, could be the brother-in-law of the owner, something like that. So preferential treatment is when the basis of that special arrangement is a relationship, not with value to the organization. Third class of deal that's not to be confused, or second class of deal not to be confused with an ideal, is the unauthorized conduct or rule-breaking category. And so this would be a circumstance in which the person who benefits from this special arrangement is the employee, but everybody else loses. And a good example of that would be somebody who, they work the grave shift, the night shift in a store. And they're kind of bored, and it's a, kind of a rotten time. They don't really get paid enough in their view to be working these late hours. So what do is, in the store, maybe they drink some of the chocolate milk that's in the dairy case because, they're hungry. And just a little bit of pilfering here. Maybe they take some cigarettes and take them home. Again, a little bit of inventory shrink. But they're breaking the rules in order to benefit themselves. And maybe the boss tolerates it because it's really hard to get good help on the grave shift. Wink, wink. But though it's kind of understood as it's going on, that's not an ideal either. A, it's not negotiated. B, it's not a benefit in any kind of sustainable way to the employer. And certainly not something that co-workers looking on would say, geez, that's kind of a practice we ought to continue. So ideals occupy a special space in the exchange relationship as a function of negotiation, as a function of their basis, the value of the worker to the firm, the quality of the employment relationship, and for the prospect, the possibility, something we want to take special pains to ensure, because there's a potential for benefiting employee and the organization. Something lacking with the other two kinds of exceptions. But sometimes these things overlap a little bit. And it's because of that overlap, that kind of blurry boundary, I'm going to try to be a little bit more clear cut and not let too much drift happen in my research and thinking about idiosyncratic deals, because we don't want to promote rule breaking or favoritism, because both of those foster an environment of injustice and unfairness in the organization. And as our last presenter did a very good job of conveying, we have plenty of injustice already. We don't need to make it worse. So let's think about where ideals fit in the context of the broader employment relationship, or if you will, the broader compensation bundle of all that good stuff that comes to us as a function of being part of an organization, being employed by it. So how many of you have a background or interest in compensation? Okay, so we got a lot of people with compensation expertise in the room. That's very important. So if you think about the issue, that a good bit of our attention towards compensation programs and efforts is focused on the distinction between standardized, available to everybody, and position-based, given to people who have different kinds of roles or come from different kinds of labor markets. And we work very hard to sort of rationalize the basis of pay systems so that there's a standard basis, that comes to people from membership. There's returns that come to people as a function of the roles they play and their market value. But where a lot less attention goes is to the idiosyncratic, individual bargain for, unique to the person, role in that compensation bundle. So thinking about this, one of the big issues in understanding the psychology of ideals is the ratio or relationship between ideals and the other set of things that are exchanged with employees as a function of their employment relationship. So in a context where standardized conditions of employment and benefits and supports are made available to all, one of the messages in that psychologically to people is that we in the organization with the same a broad basis of supports and whatnot have a common fate and a common identification with the employer. Position-based rewards signal to us our status and kind of the value of our role and our contribution. But if we have lots of standardized rewards and very few idiosyncratic and position-based rewards, status differences are downplayed in the organization. On the other hand, in organizations that offer very little as a function of membership and not so much as a function of positional contributions, and you get it because you bargained for it, that's a situation in which employees don't have much of a shared sense of rewards and benefits in common, and that their membership is collectively of value. Clearly, from looking at these, just my little picture diagrams of different kinds of bundles, you might begin to think about the idea that, geez, having ideals as the large basis on which people got their benefits and rewards probably isn't a great thing, because it might erode the basic potential for collaboration and identification of the broader organization, especially if we're employing more than one person. And that is kind of the idea. We want to be thinking about what the ideal means in the context of the larger employment relationship people are party to. So when you think about idiosyncratic deals and the kinds of things people can negotiate, think broadly. Because in my field research, I have to say, I have discovered ideals made on practically everything. Now, some of the garden variety terms in which ideals are negotiated would include things that are related to advancement, career opportunity, or having a visible job assignment. People will negotiate for that. People negotiate for job content, workload, parts of the job more interesting to them, offloading stuff they don't like to do as much. Certainly the issue of flexibility in hours or taking sabbaticals and leaves of absence come into play, so people negotiate on time. And there are plenty of examples of idiosyncratic deals based on pay, but I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But these are the garden variety things. You come across stuff like, oh yeah, there was the guy in Switzerland who negotiated so the company would pay to move his mistress's horse to the United States. You go, mistress's horse? I don't even have a category for that. So, I mean, stuff is out there. So I will not ask for any revealing, any self-disclosing statements, but how many of you personally have bargained for something different than your coworkers with an employer? So we got plenty of experience in the room. Okay, and then how many of you have done it more than once? Welcome to the world. Exactly right. And if you haven't done it more than once yet, you will. Because bargaining leads to other bargaining. Okay, so here's your chance to participate in the Are You Normal quiz. Are you ready for that? Okay. All right, so you're normal. I know you're going to do well. So I like to summarize a whole body of research in this little table here. So we've looked at the impact of idiosyncratic deals on the kind of psychological contract people experience with their employer. Lots of different studies have done this. And a couple of things that are important in the research. The first is, it does seem to be the case that timing matters. That is, when in the employment relationship is the person bargaining for something different from his or her peers? And for the purposes of this little discussion, I'm just going to make it 2 times So you can bargain before you're hired. It's called sometimes an ex-ante psychological, or ex-ante ideal, or a before-hire ideal. Or you can bargain once you're on the job. So an ex-post ideal. So we're just going to do that simple contrast for the moment. So the first issue is, if you think about the kinds of ideals that are most likely to have an effect on the psychological contract, to have an effect in strengthening the bond between the employee and the employer, creating a sense of mutual obligation and willingness to reciprocate and contribute. That's the kind of deal I'm talking about. And so here's the question. The question is, what kind of ideals have the greatest effect on creating a psychological contract? Before, after, or on the job? So how many would say before you take the job, those are the deals that are really going to affect the psychological contract? If you think that's true, say yes, raise your hand. Before hire. Before hire. And how many say no, it's after hire? After, oh, you guys are good. Okay, after hire. Okay, that's good, all right. And then the second thing is, which of these deals are most likely to reinforce and create that strong bond? And so look, I've got lists of stuff on both sides. Visibility to senior management, challenging project, promotion opportunity, greater responsibility, market-based pay increase, special equipment, vacation time and travel. Which are the kinds of things, if you would bargain for, do you think would really build that bond? You can use your words. Anybody want to nominate any of these? So which of these are going to really reinforce the bond? Visibility? Market-based pay?
Vacation.
Vacation? Nah. Okay, next.
What is it, the top three?
Challenging project. Okay, you guys are good. So basically what the data say very consistently is, first, ex-ante before hire deals don't mean diddly squat. They don't have much of an effect at all. Probably because people are thinking they gave it to me because I'm worth it, not because they're a great employer. On the other hand, if they give it to me once I'm on the job, it's a signal about the quality of our relationship. And the second thing is the stuff that matters are these much more intrinsically valuable features. I'm visible senior management, I got challenging work, I have a promotion opportunity or greater responsibility. These more, I like to call them developmental ideals that you get once you're on the job are very valuable to people and tend to increase the bond between the individual and the organization. And the other stuff don't seem to make no never mind in technical terms. So the critical issue is ideals can occur at different times. The ex-ante deals we've just talked about you make when you're hired. Ex-post deals typically are made in the context that you have a performance review at the end of the year with your manager and you talk about the future and some discussions are had, or problems that come up during the year and you go and you talk to the boss about what you need or would like to have. That'd be an ex-post kind of deal. And then the third kind of deal is the kind of deal that's made when somebody threatens to quit. All right? The difference is one deal's made during the recruiting process, the other's made in the context of a discussion of reward or needs, and the last one's made under conditions of threat. And the nature of these three deals is different. I don't have tons of time to talk about the differences now, though if you have an interest in that, I have a paper I can share with you. But the key idea is the one deal that reflects relationship quality and the employer's assessment of the employee in terms of the strength and value of the person is the ex-post performance deal. It's the one with the most, let's call it, virtuous effects. Now, here's a question for you. Which of these deals is most likely to upset coworkers? How many think it's the ex-ante, paying people something different than others, or giving people something different when you hire? The ex-ante is the most upsetting. No, okay. How many think it's the ex-post, people getting rewarded when they bargain on the job? And how many think it's the threatening to quit deal? So, oh, yeah, very good. Co-workers hate the third category, and we should. One of the big issues with regard to ex post threat to quit ideals is that everybody else is now compensated or paid less than the person who threatened to leave. Because by definition, it's not calibrated necessarily on an assessment of the relative contribution of the individuals. The key issue for us is that ideals made when threatening to quit do reward disloyalty. Not all employers warrant loyalty, but nonetheless. They suggest also that the existing reward system is out of line with the market. If you can actually get a better deal by going somewhere else, maybe the organization doesn't necessarily have a well thought out reward system broadly. But the idealer is also not necessarily the better performer or better contributor. It may simply be the person who's more mobile. And so it's really the kind of circumstance that should give one pause. You can say, yeah, it's legal, maybe not wise, however. So where I'm going with this, and what I'd like to kind of focus on with you, kind of what we've been working towards, is thinking about, I guess what I would call the triangle of justice. Now, a lot of organizations achieve fairness, or I want to say the perception of fairness, in a very problematic fashion. Fairness is achieved either by enforcing standardization across the board. You can't get anything unless it's specified by HR. Or they achieve fairness by keeping everything a secret. But I would argue that there's a difference between perceptions of fairness and fundamental justice. Justice is not a perception. It is a condition of the way in which rewards and opportunities and features are allocated. And so I'm giving it a more objective type of a condition. Creating justice in an organization reflects a multi-party set of relationships. And balancing flexibility and fairness requires conditioning the ideal on a bundle of practices and relationships. So key idea here is, I often forget if I don't push them all at once that I've got other things behind, coming up next. I'll just put them all up for you so you can see it. Our research on idiosyncratic deals suggests, and it suggests in the context of both the West and the East, so I'm saying US, Australia, and Northern Europe as one group, and the East, Japan, and Singapore, and China as another, very similar mechanisms, very similar conditions appear to be related to the perception of ideals as being fair and effectively motivating as a function of relationships between the three sides of my justice triangle. So the first issue is that employees and managers are more likely to report that the deal is fair and works well for them, the idealer and the employee and the manager, in the context where the ideal is managed not just at the time it's granted, but in its aftermath, and in how both parties conduct themselves in the post-negotiation aftermath during the existence of the ideal. On the employee co-worker side, one of the things that's time and again in multiple studies, we see that co-workers are much more accepting and positively disposed to special arrangements on the part of a peer when the peer is a friend, when a peer is somebody they have a trusting relationship with, where the peer is seen as somebody who has a legitimate need or a high contribution that warrants the deal, and where the person with the ideal shares any burdens created by their ideal and doesn't just stick the extra work onto their peers. So there's a a balancing arrangement of the conditions under which I've been granted this special deal and the effect it has on my peers. But the critical aspect here is coworkers who like and respect the eye dealer are more accepting of that deal, especially if it doesn't create problems for them. Third issue is, how do people view the manager who granted the deal to someone else? Other things being equal, trust your manager. Manager communicates openly with you. Much more positive responses to an ideal than if the manager's done it in secret or the manager treats you very differently from everybody else. So a critical idea is, ideals are socially complicated things. It's probably why we have kept them secret. But if indeed we are in an environment in which it's harder to effectively reward people in a standard sense, heterogeneous needs, people in very different roles, very different kind of employment contracts, we might need to become more facile at creating flexibility and fairness. So what I'd like to do is kind of make two last points and then take your question. So when are ideals likely to be seen as fair? When I say seen as fair, that means it's a perception, okay? Peers, first, if the peers have a choice, the peers themselves could have had an ideal if they asked for it, if they were under the same conditions, same need or same contribution. Peers are more likely to think that the ideal is fair. So if ideal is acknowledged to peers and they're aware of it and the conditions under which it's made, it makes it more of an invitation to bargain when they have a need or opportunity to create some special arrangement. Second condition is no cost. Making deals that avoid negative consequences for peers. The ideal, if you're bargaining for hours or an assignment nobody else wants, great. They'll be very happy that you have it. If peers aren't highly interdependent with their ideals, so their own life isn't disturbed by somebody having a special arrangement, they're much more likely to accept it. Win-win benefits. The idea that the peers benefit in some special way from a person having an ideal, and that's actually an interesting effect. One of the things that several of my colleagues have identified is the idea that when the person with the ideal shares to others how they made it, so that they would learn how to make their own deal, people can see that as a benefit. It opens up opportunities to them. Another issue is when the individual is somebody the peers recognize as really valuable. And I have to say, even in a university environment, I have known several circumstances in which the person who got the job offer from Harvard led to all his colleagues coming in to seeing our provost and say, keep him, give him what he wants, he can have my lab space, I'll teach his classes. Because they wanted to be in the university that kept this star person. So it was win-win because we got the bragging rights that he didn't go to Harvard and he stayed with us. Indifference to the types of resources involved. One of the things that's very important is the fact that not everything is valued equally by all people. What's an interesting assignment to you might be boring to someone else. What's great hours to you, not so nice for other people. And what we often find is that where people have more individual preferences are on what we call the particular resources. Need for support, mentoring, whatnot, as opposed to things that have to do with goods like money and more concrete, monetizable things. So the opportunity of bargaining for the more intangible things actually may be a way in which a job becomes more valuable without threatening the interests of coworkers. And last but not least, my favorite part of this is idiosyncratic deals really do offer us in HR an opportunity to begin experimenting with alternative ways of creating supports and managing people. And the notion that one might grant an ideal as an experiment to see how well it works. And as a way of generating the opportunity for innovation. Last thing I'd like to say then with regard to innovation. Idiosyncratic arrangements exist in all organizations, from the most bureaucratic to the most emergent, startup, organic environment. In innovative, organic environments, maybe everybody has an ideal. Because, hey, they can't probably pay you anyway if you're in a startup. So your hours and the nature of your work may be highly variable as a function, and that's how role-making happens in startups. In that kind of a setting, an ideal probably It is the normal way in which people are motivated. That's very different in the most bureaucratic of settings, where ideals are exceptions to rules that have to be granted by an authority to make them legitimate. So the level of flexibility to make idiosyncratic arrangements probably does vary across organizational environments. And for most organizations are really in the middle, where they've got some rules and practices that structure how things are done, but there increasingly is a broad zone of acceptance for how work gets done and the hours and modes of delivery. And it's in that environment where the opportunity to negotiate and craft experiments and new ways of doing things may be the most valuable in terms of making a workplace that's more humane and comfortable for people, as well as being effective for the organization. But a little bit of advice before I close. Ideals are not supplements for decent pay and job security. That the presence of broadly available supports for the work employees, that standardized basis of rewards and support, still signals a quality of employment relationships. But ideals can be supplements to that, to make a job more valuable and more customized to the individual. They're a way of experimenting to see what new practices might work, what will work or not work here. Ideals work when idealers are good neighbors, when the idealer is required to maintain good relationships with coworkers as a function of their special arrangement. Because in effect, we're trying to support collaboration, not competition. And if ideals are used as a basis for competition, will expect that the benefits may erode. It's important to keep track of the ideals we make, because organizations need to build memory in order to figure out what practices work for us or don't work for us. And the fact that supervisors often make them in secrecy and don't even tell other supervisors means that the learning curve may be lower than it really needs to be. And I would hope that we would see more of a role in HR in identifying these kind of local practices that might be that might augur for innovative alternatives that would be effective in the future. And last but not least, don't reward disloyalty. That repeat bargainers, people who keep coming back for the same pay bump every year or two, or some status indicator to feel that they're better positioned than their peers, erode their value to the firm and antagonize coworkers. And so the role of repeat bargaining as a dysfunctional aspect of employment, and by that I mean coming back for the same stuff over and over again, is something that really needs to be thought about. And this is as true in universities as anywhere else. If you have to bargain to get what you need all the time, that says that we're falling short in terms of the quality of our HR practices. I think of ideals as the cherry on top of the sundae, not the whole dessert. So on that note, I'm going to stop. And I'd be very happy to take your questions if you have questions.
Hi, thank you. In relation to an idiosyncratic deal as opposed to the preferential treatment of the other, you talked about the positives of a fair deal, but how many co-workers do see it as a fair deal, even when it's set up in the right way?
Oh, that's a very good question. So the question is, how many co-workers really do see a deal set up in the proper way as fair? And I'm going to go back and say, first and foremost, what do co-workers know? What is the quality of their relationship to the manager and the person with the ideal? And people who have quality relationships with the manager and with the idealer, who have good information, are more likely to see the deal as acceptable, as basically fair. So there's some preconditions. And I do think it relates to the issue that justice pays, that if people manage carefully the employment relationship, the idea that you would make an ideal under conditions that make sense to the work group is a very important factor. Some of the work I've done with Smitri Anand who's at Illinois Institute of Technology, looks at ideals in the context of work groups. And we find that when people have low variation on their LMX relationship, high leader-member exchange relationship in the group, they're much more accepting of ideals to that end. Thank you.
Hi, Denise.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you make the flexibility, fairness, balance sound great, but we all know that knowledge is a dangerous thing. Generally, isn't the employer in a position where they've got the power generally? So isn't there a risk with individual deals, idiosyncratic deals, that it's just used as a tool to drive down the employment, the value of the employment relationship to the employee? My second point on that, though, is gender pay gaps and some evidence that more flexibility in deals, the bigger the gap. Why are female faculty paid less than male faculty? And, you know, government, states, Philadelphia, I see looking at legislation to stop any discussion in that pre-employment discussion about the previous deal.
Yes.
So again, is this a worry about too much idiosyncratic dealing having negative impact?
Okay, so I think the key issue is it's a very good, legitimate question, a concern, real concern. Justice is hard work. Fairness is easy. Justice is hard work. Idiosyncratic deals cannot be a substitute for appropriately structured compensation and performance assessment systems. They're not a substitute. They're a way of being more adaptive to the fact that individuals differ and the fact that employers have incomplete information inherently on what employees might want, and policies that are universally applicable are almost impossible to write well. We don't want an organization that has so many rules that unless it's permitted, everything is forbidden. But I do think the issue is that there is benefit in idiosyncratic deals for better timing and allocating resources to people where people's interests in those resources differ. And that's a lot of stuff. And a lot of that relates to development and advancement and skill building. It also relates to stress reduction and the quality of the experience at work. So conditions of my job and where and how I do it. That individuals don't necessarily have or perceive themselves to have autonomy over that. Perhaps if more of us individually believed ourselves effective to shape our work situation without asking our boss, we wouldn't have to worry about some of these things. But there is a conditioned reaction in many cases for employees not to do something unless the boss encourages it or supports it. And so because of that lack of autonomy support, you need to have an environment in which people can have these issues raised about how to customize their work conditions. But it's not a substitute for policy and practices. My colleague Linda Babcock, who wrote the book Women Don't Ask, and she says it really is wrong. Women ask all the time, we just don't like to negotiate. We like to call it problem solving. So part of the issue is expanding that conversation so that problems are addressed in a way that employees have some voice to explore alternatives.
So we've got time for one last question.
One last question. The question was over here. I don't want to ignore you guys. I apologize for leaning to this side of the room. Yes,
Two, very quickly. As is you. Given the fact that you made all of us raise our hands if we've had an idiosyncratic deal, and almost everybody in this room has, do you not think that it's about time we made it the norm rather than the exception? There's the ability for technology to make bespoke shoes, and there's the ability for technology to figure out through algorithms that make it work.
Okay, so the question is, shouldn't idiosyncratic deals become the norm, given that so many of us have them, right? If I were to go back, you remember that slide I had up with the if you were in a startup, in innovative settings, everybody would have an ideal because it's kind of organization without a lot of policies and practices. So certainly if we were all in innovative settings, we'd all be bargaining a lot. but some of us are in universities. I guess I wouldn't call them innovative settings. Some of us are in big corporations. Pockets of innovation, a lot of other pockets not quite so flexible. I do think that the expectation that a person can ask or a person can explore or challenge a practice is increasing in the younger generation of workers, and that's something to encourage. Number one, because silent suffering is so damn painful, and number two, because people will always know more we will always know more about our own individual preferences and interests than another can know about us. Why rely on someone else to structure what rewards might come to us in organizations? Better to have more of an idea exchange and exploration. So I do think it is becoming more normative. Certainly there are fault lines. So if we look at the data from Asia, women are much less likely to bargain in the East than in the West. I thought was bad here. It's worse someplace else. Also, there is a greater tendency in organizations to give support to younger workers and not necessarily older workers unless the older workers are highly senior. So older workers benefit from being veterans, but if they're older workers who have lower tenure, they're often the least advantaged, which is an interesting issue with regard to reemployment of people in organizations over time. So I do think those kinds of issues of how do we promote it and avoid having sort of inadvertent discrimination as a function of asking, it is a real issue.
Denise, thank you so
Thank you.
much,
Thank you very much.
for a healthy helping of postprandial fairness and justice.